my pleasure to be chairing this panel on government sources, government channels and information flows. And our speakers, on my left, Sonny Serite from Botswana, of the Botswana Telegraph, a man who's willing to put his head on the block, if I can risk saying that, to carry out investigative journalism in a country that had the reputation of having a very free press, an open press, but is perhaps closing down a little bit more now. So somebody who is there fighting the good fight for media freedom. Gwen, formerly editor of the Namibian for many years during the period of South African occupation of Namibia and afterwards, and now executive chair of the Namibia Media Trust, and somebody else who really has fought the good fight. And Sue Onslow, who is, on this occasion, this is a bit like that programme Dead Ringers, is going to be Kishali Pinto Jayawardene, who unfortunately can't be here. So, and our final contestant is Martin Plaut, also Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, old colleague of mine and many of you here at the BBC World Service. And when he's finished finding things out, which I suspect is what he's doing, he will be here with us. So we will start with Sue reading Kishali's paper on Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I do have a copy of this relatively long presentation, so if I start to head up to the end of my time of 15 minutes, what I will do is bring it to a conclusion so I don't run over. But Kishali has agreed that it can be circulated for those of you that are interested. It's entitled Challenges to Media Freedom in Sri Lanka and the New Government's Performance. And I would say that Kishali, with her customary speed, has written this paper to be read rather than necessarily read aloud, so I hope I do it justice. There's a common view held by many in South Asia, and indeed across the Commonwealth, that Sri Lanka holds out a beacon of hope to the world in reversing the tide of authoritarianism by the toppling of the Rajapaksa presidency in 2015. This underscores a darker and more complex reality. Even during those early days, when elation and excitement prevailed after the surprise election defeat of the former president, Sri Lankans instinctively knew that this was just the beginning of a long, hard road towards reversing systemic rule of law failures, much of which had predated Rajapaksa's rule, 2005, of course, to the end of 2014. 2 years down the line, the extent to which the country's once energetic democratic processes had degenerated is now very clear. Under former President Mahinda Rajapaksa and his family cabal, the abuse of power had been unprecedented, even when assessed against Sri Lanka's turbulent post-independence history after British colonial fetters were shaken off in 1948. The judiciary had lost its authority, with the Chief Justice being unceremoniously dismissed from office, with an extraordinary lack of due process. Ordinary law and order had deteriorated into abysmal depths. Abductions for gain of Sri Lanka's majority Sinhalese and Tamil Muslim minorities had become common, and the office of the executive president exhibited an alarming concentration of state, economic and military power. Shaky at its best in recent decades, the scales tilted dangerously towards raw, naked authoritarianism. The military decimation of the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, brackets LTTE, in 2009, amidst high civilian casualties, were seen by the political leadership as an open sesame to treat minorities with scarcely disguised contempt. As the then army commander declared with distasteful arrogance, and I quote, "Sri Lanka is primarily the land of the Sinhalese, and the minorities should not make undue demands." During those years, freedom of expression and media freedoms were the first and most visible casualties. Editors and journalists of all ethnicities were assassinated, beaten up, threatened, and subjected to vicious character assassination. But the stage was set for this departure from the democratic process quite a while ago. Prolonged ethnic conflict as a result of decades-long secessionist war fought by the LTTE in the Northern Peninsula, and more sporadic but devastating violent clashes between the majority Sinhalese government and rebellious Sinhalese youth in the south during the early 1970s and again in the late 1980s had paved the way for emergency law to virtually replace the ordinary law of the land. More and more power came to be vested in the executive presidency bypassing the separation of powers doctrine and the checks and balances which had once held arbitrary executive discretion in check. Under the Kumaratunga presidency, the immediate predecessor to Mahinda Rajapaksa, the hallowed institution of the Supreme Court, headed by her hand-picked Chief Justice, suffered severe politicisation, with judgments being dictated by political imperatives. Attacks on critical journalists waxed and waned during particular periods, with criminal defamation law being used to stifle dissenters until a vigorous campaign led by the media resulted in the repeal of those provisions. Consequently, the excesses of the Rajapaksa presidency was a natural, and to some a logical, culmination of all that had gone before. Regardless, a restive, if not angry populace was ripe for change when, following a surprise announcement of the premature presidential election in late 2014, Rajapaksa's one-time health minister, Maritpala Sirisena, deserted his party leader and crossed over to contest the January 2015 presidential election, with the support of the opposition United National Party after months of covert planning. It was an explosive electoral challenge in the best traditions of the country's excitable party politics, capturing the imagination and hope of Sri Lankan citizens who voted for the challenger across the length and breadth of the country. But the 2015 reformist agenda has effectively been undermined by subversive forces that were very much part of the same establishment that had posed grave threats to the democratic process. Great Expectation and the government's reform agenda and RTI. One of the main thrusts of the reform agenda, concerned with the restoration of rule of law safeguards, including the independence of the judiciary, the enactment of a right to information law and a contempt of court act, among a host of other pending media law reforms, including the broad basing of state-owned media. That's quite a sentence. The other equally imperative focus was on state accountability for gross human rights abuses, including a commission on truth, justice and reconciliation and non-recurrence, an office on missing persons, an office on reparations, and a judicial mechanism with a special counsel. In addition, a consensus resolution on Sri Lanka adopted at the United Nations Human Rights Council promised the reform of Sri Lanka's Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act, PTA, under which journalists, dissenters and activists had routinely been imprisoned. In both these respects, the progress made has been faltering. Where the accountability process is concerned, little significant steps have been evidenced, apart from a law on the Office of Missing Persons, which remains, however, yet inactivated. Similar dysfunction affects the victim and witness protection law. In addition, efforts have been made by hawkish elements within the government to deny the benefit of immediate legal counsel to a suspect upon being arrested by proposed amendments to the criminal procedure law. Cases of journalists who have been killed or severely beaten and tortured during the previous regime have not yet been brought to justice, despite 2 years having elapsed since that promise was first made. In regard to media law reform, the one significant advancement is in the area of right to information. On the 23rd of June 2016, the Parliament unanimously passed the Right to Information Act. The struggle to enact an RTI law was taken well over 1.5 decades. In 1998, the Colombo Declaration on Media Freedom and Social Responsibility by the Media Industry focused on RTI as the primary thrust for media law reform. Subsequently, a Prime Ministerial Committee comprising senior editors, lawyers, representatives of media organisations and civil society, as well as high public officials, including the Attorney General and the Justice Secretary, drafted the 2004 Freedom of Information Bill, which was approved by the then Cabinet and tabled in Parliament. However, the premature dissolution of Parliament by the then President Kumaratunga resulted in the bill being cast into cold storage, despite 1 or 2 attempts to revive it during the decade that followed. That bill was activated as a template in 2015, when the Sirisena Wickremesinghe government had to abide by popular pressure to bring an RTI law into force. Following months of hectic drafting to revise its contents in order to reflect modern developments on RTI, and after engaging in public consultations on its contents, the RTI bill was approved by the Cabinet. It passed the test of legal challenge before the Supreme Court, subject to certain modifications, and was, to the surprise of many who were expecting vigorous opposition on the floor of the House, passed with nary a single opposing vote in Parliament. As a member of both drafting committees in 2004 and in 2015-2016, it was a rare day of rejoicing indeed. Some months ago, a constitutional amendment had also brought in the right of access to information in a new constitutional provision. So RTI was buttressed by two supports, one constitutional and the other statutory. That said, the fact that the constitutional restrictions, drafted through a different process to the Act, were somewhat broader in scope than the narrowly defined restrictions in the RTI Act did give rise to some unease. The positive aspects of the RTI law. Nonetheless, there was much to be pleased about. Ranked globally as the third best RTI regime, the Act does not exempt any particular agency from its reach, unlike other RTI laws in the region, including in India, which excludes 18 state agencies, including its intelligence arms. It categorises types of information to be exempted, which also encompasses common exceptions inter alia of privacy and national security, but subjects them all to a public interest override. The Act specifically prescribes that all information requests must be considered on the basis of maximum disclosure. Information officers appointed to all public authorities are required to test that request against the public interest. So, for example, if there is a denial of information, the information officer is duty-bound to show that the harm caused by releasing the information is greater than the public interest. Thereafter, in the case of a denial, the matter must go to the designated officer in that public authority. In both these instances, the respective officers must state the reasons, the specific section relating to the exemption under which they're refusing the request, and justify it as not falling within the public interest override. Finally, if that denial is upheld by the designating officer, then the information requester could appeal to the Independent RTI Commission, which is the primary policy-making and appellate body under the Act, and finally to the courts. The Commission consists of 5 members appointed by the President, as recommended by the Constitutional Council, chosen by nomination of specific bodies, including the organisations of editors and publishers, the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, and civil society groups. Strict time periods are laid down under the Act for the consideration of information request and also for the appeal. Delay beyond those time limits will give rise to disciplinary consequences. The RTI Commission has been vested with prosecutorial powers in respect of taking offenders to court. In terms of cost, liberal rules of the Commission prescribe that the information application can be lodged at no cost. Moreover, information provided through email is free, the first 4 pages of a printout or photocopy is free, and the first hour of inspection of a document is free. Also, the rules state that the information granted is granted free on a successful appeal. Reimbursement to the requester of information can be directed by the Commission if information is not given within the stipulated time. The reach of the Act is meanwhile exceptionally wide. It applies to public authorities as defined to include constitutional and statutory entities, government departments and bodies, corporate bodies in which government has a controlling interest, local and provincial authorities, courts, tribunals and institutions established to administer justice, and private entities working under contract, agreement, license or partnership with the government, where their statutory or public service or function is concerned. Also included is higher educational, private vocational or technical education institutions, established, recognised or licensed under any written law or funded wholly or partly by the state, and non-governmental organisations rendering a service to the public who are substantially funded by government, foreign government or international organisations. Proceeding from theory to practice. Certainly, if the RTI is implemented properly, Sri Lanka will move towards transparency in government and the non-government sector, along with the corporate and private sector that utilise public money. Will the RTI law be an exception to a pattern of practically ineffectual laws, good laws? Will it radically transform the culture of secrecy that holds Sri Lanka's political and public service establishment in its iron grip? Answering these questions require more than extraordinary prophetic ability. But, unlike other laws, which depend upon dysfunctional institutions of the state prosecutor and the judiciary for enforcement, RTI can be directly used by citizens to provoke, needle, demand accountability from the political leadership. early signs are to the positive. Challenges ahead. A new counter-terror law. Do I have time to go on with
You
this?
have 2 more minutes.
Read it more quickly. Unlike RTI, developments in regard to the replacement of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, PTA, have, however, been far less happy. Though the government promised to repeal or reform the PTA in order to make it more compatible with international protections of civil liberties, the converse has happened. Dangerously vague and overbroad definitions of what constitutes terrorism and terrorism-related offences have been brought into a draft of Sri Lanka's new Counter-Terrorism Act, proposed as replacing the PTA. The definition of terrorism-related offences proceeds on almost the same terminology reflected in the old emergency regime. Restraining elements of necessity and proportionality appear to be absent. Terrifyingly familiar language echoes in the CTA's classification of terrorism-related offences. This prohibits words either spoken or intended to be read or by signs, etc., which causes or intends to cause commission of acts of violence between different communities or racial or religious groups. The prohibition is coupled with intent to cause harm to the unity, territorial integrity or sovereignty of Sri Lanka or the coexistence of the peoples. Journalists and dissenters were imprisoned in the past precisely under these same provisions in the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Its proposed replacement, CTA, continues this trend with an importation of additional references to unity and peaceful coexistence. These prohibitions are contrary to the Johannesburg Principles on National Security, freedom of expression and access to information. Further, the inclusion of an offence of espionage in regard to the gathering and providing of confidential information relating to the listed offences is exceptionally chilling. What constitutes confidential information is vaguely defined and awakens echoes of the unloved colonial-era Official Secrets Act. This bodes ill for the new information culture, supposedly a clarion call made by this government. Apart from overbroad definitions of offences, the proposed CTA also infringes civil liberties in its conferment of wide powers on law enforcement officers to obtain information from service providers. A police officer not below the rank of superintendent of police is empowered to call for information from any telecommunications, digital or satellite providers, again without adequate judicial oversight. This includes any information pertaining to services that may be provided or used to or by any person, information or data, documents or records that may be stored, archived or otherwise kept by such provider. Notably, it also includes uploading or downloading of data by such service provider. Further, the provision of immediate legal counsel to suspects arrested under this law remains ambiguous. Earlier, the government had repeatedly refused to allow this right, insisting that access to legal counsel be afforded only after the police interrogations had taken place. This was despite well-documented reports showing that the incidence of torture of suspects in police custody, which is an endemic problem in Sri Lanka, takes place in the first few hours after arrest. Conclusion. As has been discussed in this brief discussion paper, ambitious reform plans of the coalition leadership, led by President Sirisena and Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe of the UNP, have been slowly collapsing into disarray. While some progress has been evidenced, there has also been regression. The one positive factor that has stubbornly prevailed is the freedom of debate, public debate. This was a luxury that citizens could ill afford during the Rajapaksa decade, due to the immediate negative repercussions that this would attract. Nonetheless, as I repeatedly emphasised in the weekly column that I write in the Colombo-based Sunday Times, the coalition government's incessant reminders to its robust critics that things are not as bad as they once were is really no answer at all. Setting the bar of comparison at the previous regime's standard of governance is akin to no standard at all. Certainly, far more than was expected from the new government, which resoundingly promised the restoration of the rule of law. And providing the space for freedom of expression is of limited use when the structures of state power remain as impervious as ever to critical public opinion. In addition, increased public critiques have left the government bitter. It has vowed to bring in a regulatory framework, the media encompassing print and electronic and online. While it must be said that the professionalism of the Sri Lankan media has deteriorated badly, in major part due to the travails which it has had to undergo, government regulation should not be the solution to that problem. Cloaked in the deceptively misleading language of independent regulation, the country's history shows good examples of how such innocuous experiments can be twisted to a government's advantage. Equally puzzling are statements by some ministers stating that RTI is a quid pro quo exchange, In other words, the logic is that as RTI has been given to the media, it should submit to the proposed regulatory scheme. This language suffers from a fundamental misconception. RTI is not a privilege to be bestowed at the magnanimity of politicians. Rather, it is a people's right, and any suggestion of a quid pro quo is unfortunate. There is therefore a squandering of the constituency of change which is regrettable. In 2015, the change makers were ordinary citizens from far-flung corners of the north, east and south, who reacted with powerful anger against state-sponsored racism, chauvinism and corruption. This was the true courageous heart of the citizenry, but this critical constituency of reform is being eroded day by day. These are the dilemmas that pro-democracy activists continue to face in Sri Lanka.
Okay, thank you very much. We will now move on to our two presentations on Africa. Martin Plaut, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, former Africa editor at the BBC World Service. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Something happened this morning while we were sitting here, which I thought I'd just bring to your attention, because in a sense it puts in perspective everything that I'm going to say. It was that the trade union movement, COSATU, came out with a statement calling on President Zuma to resign. And I'll just say what they said. They discussed the last week's cabinet reshuffle and used three guiding questions to assess its decision. Whether the reshuffle was in the best interest of the ANC and the country, if it takes the fight against corruption forward, and if it was based on merit. And the General Secretary said the answer to each of these was no. And as a result, they've called for Mr. Zuma to go. I'm afraid we are in the most critical moment in South Africa's history since 1994, and it is by no means clear where South Africa is going or where we will end up with. In about a week's time, there's likely to be a vote of no confidence in Parliament, and frankly, one side will win. And we don't know whether it will be President Zuma and his financial backers, the Guptas, and all of those that come with them, or whether it will be the rest of society, and including all of the opposition. So it is a critical moment, and we just don't know where it is. And of course the media have a huge role to play in all of this. Unfortunately, the media are not what they once were. The hopes that existed under Nelson Mandela have faded. Gradually, South Africa has gone down the scale of media freedom. Freedom House, the American organization, designates the country's media as partly free, and I think they're about right. The Mo Ibrahim Index has seen a gradual erosion, falling over the last 15 years by 8.8 points in their strange scale. And frankly, the erosion of media support and freedom has echoed the gradual erosion of the support of the ruling party. And as its support has deteriorated, and as it has fallen into corruption, it has basically become increasingly repressive. Let me just quote the party's parliamentary chief whip, Jackson Tembo, who put it despairingly, "We have become corrupt to the core. All we are concerned about is the accumulation of wealth, as if there is no tomorrow." That's the ANC's chief whip. Now, just to put that in some kind of perspective, South Africa has a long and very proud tradition of journalism. Goes back to the earliest newspaper, 1824, the South African Commercial Advertiser, and soon these were joined by ethnic press, both the Afrikaanse Patriot from 1876 and Imvo, which was formed under the extraordinary John Tenga Jabavu of 1884. So it goes back a tremendous distance. The most important innovation after that was in 1936, when the South African Broadcasting Corporation comes in and is given a monopoly in the broadcasting space, which existed until the 1980s. But it was always an organisation, although it had many features of the BBC in its constitution, it was always a state organisation, and not one that was prepared to allow a diversity of views. I'm sure you don't need to be reminded of the repression that existed under apartheid and the problems that the media had in reporting in those days, including people paying with their lives. But there is one point that is worth remembering, which is the information scandal which took place when the state began pouring resources into alternative media, in particular the Citizen newspaper. It was designed to take on the liberal Rand Daily Mail, and it did so successfully. The other element of the information scandal, which became known as the Muldergate scandal, was that money was also poured into foreign journalists, and foreign journalists in this country, in America, were bought. It was as simple as that. They were given wined and dined and bought. Despite this, a flourishing media did take place after the Soweto uprising of 1976, and you've got a range of different organizations, including of which probably the best known is the Weekly Mail. But there were a range of them. They were not just alone. At the end of apartheid, it was of course assumed that the problems would be over. And under Nelson Mandela, generally they were. He was somebody who welcomed the media and said so publicly, although there were times when he was pretty frustrated with it and made that known too. The same cannot be said of the ownership of the media, which was highly concentrated, although some black groups did begin to buy into it. And so you have people like Dr. Motlana, who formed the New African Publishing, which bought the Sowetan, and Cyril Ramaphosa also bought chunks of the Times media. This was the golden era. It was hoped that the ANC would oversee a generally liberal position with a diverse press, and there were organizations initiated to increase the diversity. Unfortunately, this has gradually been eroded. While Thabo Mbeki was sometimes hostile to the media, I think it would be fair to say that Jacob Zuma has been almost universally hostile to the media, except the media that he owned. And in a sense, there have been four major developments that have taken place under Jacob Zuma. The first is that the SABC has been transformed by their process of deploying cadre into the senior leadership so that it is now no longer even remotely considered an objective organization. And the importance of the SABC should not be underestimated. Its 23 radio stations, in addition to all of its other outlets, are absolutely vital in the rural areas where, frankly, no one else has the reach. So if you want to get to the rural areas where the majority of South Africans still live by a small number, it's what you have to go. And Snooky Zikalela, who was Thabo Mbeki's man, already brought in some restrictions, banning certain commentators from the SABC, including, bizarrely, Maletsi Mbeki, Thabo's own brother. But let's leave that aside. This becomes much worse under Jacob Zuma, where an organization put down rules that 70% of all the output of the SABC should be positive. They should have sunshine news. Well, we know where that leads. Even that was not sufficient, and there was then another edict which was brought out that there would be no reporting of any kind of activity which led to the burning down or attack on government buildings. So these were no longer to be reported anymore. So that's the first thing, the seizure of the SABC. The second is that they learned from the Muldergate scandal. In fact, in some ways they improved on it. And they have been using state funds to fund the media that they like. This has happened in two ways. The New Age, which is owned by the Gupta family, which are, as I said, were Jacob Zuma's financiers, has had vast amounts of money poured into it, both by parastatals and by government organizations. And then you have a situation where the SABC, which holds a series of broadcasts, has actually been using its own money to pour money into the New Age or into ANN7, which is owned by the Guptas. So you have the channeling of finances, despite the terrible financial circumstances of the SABC. They've actually moved resources from the SABC into the Gupta family organizations in order to make sure that they get the kind of coverage that they want. The third element is the purchase and seizing of critical newspapers. So both the state funds through the Public Investment Corporation and through two Chinese companies have been used to purchase critical media. Cape Argus, Cape Times, the Mercury, the Star, the Pretoria News are amongst those that have changed hands and now take a non-critical view of the government. This was particularly true in the Cape Times position, where the editor was fired because she frankly revealed some of the secrets of what was going on. She won on appeal, but that didn't do her much good. The fourth element is black operations, by which I don't mean anything to do with the colour of anyone's skin. What I mean is the covert operations that have begun to take place. So, for example, there was a covert war room was established by the ANC, which was used to denigrate and to attack opposition organizations during the 2016 local elections. And, as it was revealed, a covert team initially known as the War Room was intended to disempower DA, Democratic Alliance, and EFF campaigns, and to make sure that there was a pro-ANC use of the media. That is what's been going on. It has gone further than that since that we discover. Under Pravin Gordhan, who you may be aware was the finance minister until a few days ago when he was removed, that the state security sector, which of course Jacob Zuma ran in exile and he has populated the security services with people who are of like minds as he is, produced a security report alleging that Pravin Gordhan was in London plotting the overthrow of Jacob Zuma. Nobody believes this. Well, perhaps Jacob Zuma does, but I can't think that anybody else believes this. It's just utter nonsense. But this is the sort of black operation which is being used. Also, they have actually members of the state security services have gone around and spoken to journalists in their own homes, in their villages, and basically threatened them with what is going on. Now, this is before the current critical situation took place. If this is what he was capable of when he was simply under threat and not literally in a moment of crisis, what is he going to do? Having said this, I would not wish to overstate the situation, although clearly it is bad. It is important that there are a range of independent and highly reputable newspapers, Business Day, City Press, Weekly Mail, and combative and investigative blogs including Amambungane, the Rand Daily Mail, and Politics Web. There are also a range of alternative news channels and independent radio stations. But I'm afraid the hopes of a free press under the ANC are gone. And as the situation becomes more critical politically, I think the repression that the press will face will only become more severe. Thank you.
Questions, please, on what Martin's had to say. And could you say who you are when you ask a question or make a comment?
I'd rather someone else come.
Peter Burden.
Peter Burden, ex-BBC, based in Johannesburg. Martin, one thing we always say about South Africa, and I think it's very apposite for this conference, is that the judiciary is a very strong bulwark against the kind of measures that you bring. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the strength of the judiciary and can that hold?
Can it hold? I'm not a lawyer. The honest answer is I don't know, and I don't think anybody can know. There was a very good piece by one of our colleagues who now lives, Carmel Rickard, who actually argued quite strongly that the judiciary cannot rein in the president. That yes, they can act as a bulwark to support other people, but in the end it is going to take active citizenry on the streets to actually change the situation. There are a range of organizations. The Anglican Church, other church groups have come out against what is happening. There's a movement now called Save South Africa. Many people like Ahmed Kathrada, before his tragic death very recently, made it absolutely clear that they were on the side of those who were trying to rein in the president. But I'm afraid I don't know whether they will be successful, because there was an article recently which pointed out that individual members of parliament can make up to 200,000 rand a month. Now, in order for the no confidence vote to get through, they need 60 or 70 MPs from the ANC to change sides and vote against Jacob Zuma. It's going to be a vote which will not be a secret vote. The Speaker of Parliament has said she will not allow that. That means they're going to have to put their careers on the line. Will they be in the winning camp, or will they just be a fine bunch of losers? Nobody knows. They certainly don't know, and won't know probably until the actual moment that it takes place, which is why I would assume I would not bet on Jacob Zuma losing. He is a real survivor. So yes, the Constitutional Court is vital and important. Can it save South Africa? I would answer no.
Richard.
Yeah, Richard Vaughan, a former journalist. My query is about SABC. You pinpointed the way it had been sort of taken over, reduced in money, and some of its money is then pushed into the pro-ANC or pro-Zuma press. Assuming that Zuma goes, and it's obvious that the Triple Alliance is no more, 2 of the 3 bits have now gone, how, in the light of what's happened in the past, the transfer after apartheid of SABC, then the transfer after Mbeki was forced out, what can be done to democratize, make more objective the SABC? There must be some lessons learned, and I guess that may apply in other parts of the Commonwealth where there are effectively state broadcasters and where also regimes change.
Well, I think there are 2 things that need to be done. The first is, in a sense, to implement the independent elements which exist in the SABC's constitution. If they were actually enacted, it would be a different organisation. The second thing is to frankly get rid of the ANC placed men and women who've been sitting on top of the organisation, and to allow the journalists, of which there are many, and there are many good journalists, both within and outside to flourish and do their job. And if that was allowed, then, there's absolutely, I don't know what Peter thinks, but I don't see any reason why the SABC shouldn't be a good organisation. Do you agree?
Totally.
Yeah.
It's very, very sad.
And hand over to Sonny Serite from Botswana, the Telegraph, to talk about the situation of the media in Botswana.
Thank you, Keith. Martin has put pressure on me to arise. Let me first start off by thanking my sister Iris from Botswana. What a pleasant surprise to see you here. She lives in London and she made all the time to come here. Thank you. I appreciate it. In my country, Botswana, being a journalist is a nightmare. Obtaining information from the government is every journalist's nightmare. The government has created a fortress on the channels that are supposed to facilitate the flow of information from the government to the media and by extension to the public. For a very long time, the world has been hoodwinked, perhaps by these rankings and ratings from these agencies that rank the country's democratic credentials, to believe that Botswana is a shining example of democracy in Africa. The world has been made to view my country as Africa's beacon of hope in as far as democracy is concerned. I'm happy to have to say all this in front of men and women of your stature, men and women of your intellect who possess unquestionable wisdom on what a true democracy ought to look like. I have no doubt you'll agree with me that democracy without media freedom and freedom to information is a mockery. Botswana's democracy is just a facade because it lacks one of the basic tenets of a true democracy, freedom of access to information. Last year in September, my country was celebrating 50 years of independence from this great nation, Britain. But for 50 years now, my government is still refusing to enact a law on freedom of information. For 50 years now, my government still refuses to liberate and embrace the media as an integral component in the cogwheel of democracy. The relationship between the media and the government in my country has never enjoyed any mutual understanding or cordial coexistence. While the situation has always been bad, I'm sorry to say it has now gotten worse. We have regressed drastically in the past 8 years or so. So sad is the situation that it has now almost become a crime to be a journalist in Botswana. We are arrested for doing our job. Our newspapers and radio stations are starved of government advertising revenue as punishment. We are being gagged from doing our job, which is to relay information to the public. Being a media practitioner in Botswana nowadays requires the heart and the guts. The profession has become a no-go area for the faint-hearted. Many of our trained journalists are abandoning the profession and are now going onto the other side. They are flooding the public relations arena. They now prefer the less risky task of providing journalists with information instead of probing for information. I'm not exaggerating anything here, ladies and gentlemen, for I have no reason to. I'm speaking from experience and from the benefit of having been to the US during the presidential elections, and now here in the UK, where I continue to witness and learn about the importance of media freedom and the free flow of information in true democracies. The situation is not helped by our current president, who has gone on record publicly proclaiming his disdain for the media, especially the private media. The president has on several occasions labeled the media unpatriotic for reporting about anything negative about his government and the country. Are you shocked? If you are shocked, prepare for this. I want to tell you this. Ever since he ascended the presidency 9 years ago in 2008, President Khama has never held a single press conference to allow for interaction with the media. He has never attended a single United Nations meeting, a Commonwealth meeting, and I think he has only attended 1 or 2 African Union meetings. He has never allowed the media to ask him questions or engage him on his government's policies. That is how sadly the channels of information are blocked in my country. Every time we as media practitioners attempt to get information from government, the officials insist on being sent a questionnaire. Nothing wrong with that. The only problem is they will never respond to your questions. If you are lucky to get a response, it will be a category we can neither confirm nor deny. Their favorite one is, we are unable to respond because that is an internal matter. But do you know what qualifies as an internal matter in Botswana? If you ask how much of the taxpayers' money has been spent on buying the president a private jet. He's a connoisseur of aviation. He has 4 jets, private jets. Okay, they are supposed to be for government, but they are specifically and exclusively used by him. He flies himself, he drives himself. Government has public relations practitioners in all of its departments, but they are not sanctioned to share information without the express authority of their politically appointed supervisors, being permanent secretaries and cabinet ministers. Let me give you a living example of the nightmare of being a journalist in Botswana. Our president, a very adventurous man, I must say, was once attacked by a cheetah while trying to feed it. I got wind of the incident and immediately contacted the government spokesperson, chief spokesperson. While his voice confirmed the incident, his words denied it. It was only after I threatened that I will rather the cheetah made mincemeat out of the president's face that he eventually gave in and confirmed the incident. I asked him why they have not issued a public statement about the issue, and he said it was not necessary because it was one of those freak accidents. I mean, we all know in serious countries, the nation is informed even when the head of state has a headache. Well, maybe not, but in a situation where the president ends up with stitches all over his face, I think it was important for the nation to be informed. If not in the interest of the public, then at least in the public interest. Our late vice president got admitted in hospital for several days and government would not issue any statement even when we probed for it. Taxpayers' money was used for his medical expenses, but the government spokesperson, after many days of denying any knowledge about the hospitalization of the VP, now resorted to telling us the VP's admission into hospital was a private and personal issue. So we pay for the VP's private and personal issues? And by the way, we are not asking what he was suffering from. All we wanted was to pass on to the nation that the VP was not well. That's all we wanted to say. You know what? Your vice president is not well. He's been admitted. That's all we wanted. But they couldn't confirm that. And now you see that denial. It cost the VP the prayers from the nation. Unfortunately, he ended up passing on. May his soul rest in peace. We went ahead and reported the story anyway, despite the fact that this denial by the government spokesperson was eating on the credibility of our story. Because if we read that the VP is admitted, and then the chief spokesperson of government says, no, we don't know anything of that nature, people start to wonder, but why would the government spokesperson deny that the VP is admitted? So it was eating on the credibility of our story. You probably know about the plight of the Bushmen in my country, who were forcefully relocated from their ancestral land in the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. A UK-based human rights organization, Survival International, led by a good man called Stephen Curry, your countryman, some of you here, fought on the side of the Bushmen. They put it to government that the relocation had nothing to do with improving the lives of the Bushmen, but was motivated by government's desire to commission the mining of diamonds in the area. Our government denied all this and even attempted to use us to paint Survival International as a bad organization that goes around peddling lies. Guess what? The Bushmen were eventually forced out of their land, and no sooner had their footprints disappeared on the Kalahari sands than the mining operations started. The government had blocked the channel of information regarding the true motive behind the forced relocations. Government-owned media, radio, television, newspapers have no editorial independence. They are censored on what they should and should not put out to the public. They are not allowed to report on the positive, or they are only allowed to report on the positives and achievements of government. As a developing country, an African country, by the way, Botswana has not escaped the African curse, corruption. As an investigative journalist, my interest is more on exposing corruption in my country, and I need to tell you, it is a risky undertaking. Instead of being viewed as a stakeholder in the fight against corruption, I'm viewed as an enemy of the government. Because you know what? This corruption is perpetuated by government officials and political leaders. I have exposed corruption cases in my country. In the absence of freedom of access to information, I end up applying unconventional methods of access to information that should otherwise be freely available to the public. Last year in March, I was roughed up by security agents, locked up in a police holding cell for the night, and later transferred to a prison that accommodates hardened and convicted criminals, where I spent harrowing 3 days before I was eventually released on bail. I was denied access to my lawyer after my arrest. I was handcuffed and leg-ironed as I was being taken to the magistrate court to answer for charges that initially started as breach of national security and then changed to receiving stolen property. I spent all these days in jail while the police were still investigating. Yes, in my country, they arrest and detain you and investigate later. They ended up dropping the charges after the prosecuting authority advised them that I had no case to answer. I had been arrested on suspicion I was going to receive a confidential file from an employee of the office of the president. I was arrested, detained, put in jail for suspicion I was going to receive a file. I had not yet received the file, but still I spent 4 nights in jail. Of course, yes, at the time, I was doing an investigation on one of the president's private secretaries who had used public funds to settle his medical expenses for an injury he had sustained outside his official duties. They were doing some stunts with quad bikes somewhere there. He broke his ribs, but then government took care of his medical expenses. I wanted to find out. I first asked, how much is the government spending on his medical expenses? I couldn't get the answers. So they knew I was working on this story, and then they suspected someone in the office of the president because he had phoned me was about to give me the information. So we were arrested on suspicion he was going to give me the file. So that is how desperate my government wants to block all channels of information flow in my country. I've told you that for 50 years, the law on free access to information has not been passed. But with the advent of social media, Facebook, my people are taking to Facebook to vent out their frustrations. And guess what? It took just one day to pass the law on cybercrime, because now cybercrime in my country, it can mean everything. I mean, whatever you post, if say you post, the president says something and you want to post, you can't say, if it's not the truth, you need to be careful how you phrase it, because you can't say the president lied. It falls under cybercrime. Perhaps you should say he was economic with the truth. You know, you need to be careful what you post on social media. And then, just recently, it took only 24 hours to pass a law on electronic voting machines. The nation doesn't approve of the law, but it was passed overnight. Still, important pieces of legislation are not passed, but the ones that are self-serving for the current government and the leaders, they quickly get passed. So right now, 2019, my people will be using the electronic voting machine. It was passed, and then they sent the IEC Secretary General to go around the country consulting. I mean, how do you pass a law and then you consult the people? But you're supposed to consult and then pass the law based on what the feedback you get from the people. But now the feedback is terrible. They're saying no to the EVMs, but the law has already been passed. We don't know what's going to happen. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
And Gwen,
Right.
you can wrap all this up for us.
Wrap it up, I can try. Good afternoon, everybody. Looking at this topic of government channels and information flows, and especially what some of our panelists have had to say, I think I've drawn together a couple of threads on some of the problems, the issues facing the media in the Commonwealth, and also perhaps to bring into the picture the role of the Commonwealth itself in some of these problems. So hearing what some of our panelists have had to say on this topic, I think it seems very clear that there's a deteriorating media environment across the Commonwealth, with largely blocked government channels and impeded information flows with very few exceptions. And I think it's also true to say, and I think we must deduct this since this is a conference about the Commonwealth, that really unless, and the Commonwealth has thus far really failed to put media freedom front and center of the agenda. Unless they're going to do so in the very, very near future indeed, I think it's safe to say that all credibility will be lost in the Commonwealth as any kind of institution that's going to stand for freedoms as far as its members are concerned. I think I'm more fortunate in that I hail from one of the Commonwealth countries which is regarded as one of the best in Africa for media freedom, that is Namibia. But nevertheless, democracy, especially on our continent, is always very fragile. And many of the problems which are apparent in less free Commonwealth environments, and we've heard a lot about those today, are mirrored in our own. A very high number of Commonwealth countries have depressing records on press freedom, and they include high attrition rates on journalists and bloggers in Pakistan, India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Uganda, among others, which have seen also a very high rate of impunity. It's very depressing to note the UNESCO statistic that in only one case out of 103 journalists killed in Africa between 2006 and 2015, only one killer was convicted. In other situations, perhaps not as extreme, there are very draconian working conditions for journalists, and they are evident in a lot of Commonwealth countries, such as some of our kingdoms like Swaziland and Lesotho, also places like Cameroon, and increasingly physical attacks on journalists across the continent. Adding to this bleak picture, and I think that's been painted here today by Sonny and by Martin, are the setbacks to freedoms that have occurred in countries which were always deemed to be more progressive. And they do include South Africa and Botswana. I mean, Botswana, for example, is always held up as this beacon for democracy on the continent, and we've heard from Sonny today that this isn't in fact the case. And all of these scenarios have very serious implications for both the free flow as well as access to information for the citizens of these countries, and ultimately an ill effect on democracy and good governance. So I think it's quite significant to note now that criticisms of the Commonwealth's poor record on press freedom also have been prevalent for a number of years. There have been a lot of calls, as Martin and others know, for a fresh start, but nothing really seems to have happened, and neither has it spurred many of those governments, Commonwealth governments, into action. I wanted to pick up something which isn't strictly part of my ambit here, but when reading the Commonwealth Charter of 2013, I think it's true to say that that charter doesn't go far enough to redress the situation as far as media freedom is concerned. And if I quote from it, it says, "We are committed to the free flow of information and free and responsible media," unquote. And I would say there's a very lukewarm statement in the Charter which doesn't really enable the Commonwealth to do anything too dramatic about ensuring that there is media freedom. The word responsible obviously springs out as those of us from the African continent about responsible to whom? So I think we need to lose phrases like that if we're really going to give effect to carrying out press freedom, certainly in the Commonwealth. I think it's very important to state quite unequivocally and in very strong language that media is a vital watchdog against corruption and bad governance, most especially in developing countries, where political opposition is fragmented and civil society is very weak. And perhaps this isn't something that I know it applies in Botswana to a large extent, South Africa less so, where civil society is more active. In a country like my own, both of the above apply. Very fragmented opposition to the ruling party, which is dominant, and a very weak civil society. And in those scenarios, free and independent media become even more critical. There are also calls generally, and I think some people did that this morning, to say there's a need for governments to put more into the training of journalists and support for media. But if I may play devil's advocate, I'd say that this is the wrong approach. Governments and governments of the Commonwealth or anywhere else, their first and foremost duty and responsibility is to facilitate an enabling environment for, and I quote from the Windhoek Declaration, a free, independent and pluralistic media to exist. That is their job, is to provide for that environment. And I think I look at a number of points in which they need to really pay some attention if the media is to become more free, and that could be some pointers for the Commonwealth as well. There was discussion this morning, not so much on this panel, about state regulation of the media, and I think it's very important to notice there's a very different scenario in so-called first world and third world countries when it comes to perceptions about regulation. And whereas you here in the UK may have a very vibrant debate about co-regulation and whether it can work, in Africa the tendency is to say, as soon as you hear the word state regulation, it means the government wants to control everything. And it must be understood that most of African countries, including South Africa, but the rest as well, have been coming out of an environment where the New World Information and Communication Order of UNESCO of 1971 really empowered African governments to take control of the media. And that's why you see in so many African countries control, and Martin illustrated what the case is in South Africa, increasing control of the SABC, of radio, of their own newspapers, of sometimes state news agencies. So if we had to have that discussion back home about, and it is threatened, it's usually a threat. So it's a direct challenge to media freedom in our countries. Once the government says, we will control the media because you're not doing a good enough job yourselves, we need to fight against that. So as I say, there might be a very different debate to what you have here in the UK as to what we are having back in several African countries. A lot was said about by our Sri Lankan colleague and also by Sonny about access to information laws. I think they're called right to information laws in some places, access to information laws in others. And there's been a strong push on the African continent in particular by the African Platform on Access to Information to get all African countries to commit to an ATI law. So Botswana, we know, is dragging its feet. In my own country, Namibia, we've been pushing for government to draw up an ATI. In fact, we've even worked with government to try and put a good draft on the table, and we worked on the AU model law in this regard. But I'm afraid to say, although that happened some months ago, the draft is still sitting on the minister's table. There are currently, I think, some 19 countries in Africa which have ATI legislation with varying degrees of success. But I think it's important to say that such laws are not simply there for window dressing. And I think the Sri Lankan colleague indicated that some of the constraints that are put in place by governments when they are pretending to give more access to information, but they take back with the other hand, is becoming all too common. So we really have to, civil society has to be very active in all these countries enacting these laws just to make sure that they are effective in providing access to citizens and media alike. I also think, and this has come up as well this morning, it's vital that the Commonwealth lends its voice to the eradication of laws which both inhibit and have a chilling effect on the work of free and independent media. And laws of criminal defamation surely top this list. In countries like Nigeria, for example, the law on criminal defamation stands in stark contrast to that of that same country's commitment to access to ATI. So there are a lot of very strange situations where laws actually fight against each other. I also think the issue of impunity, we can't lose sight of that while many of us as journalists come from countries in various degrees of freedom, and I think what someone said from the floor earlier is very pertinent, that the absence of oppression does not always mean there is an environment of media freedom, but we cannot forget, especially colleagues in those countries where they are dying for simply doing their work. And there's no doubt that the Commonwealth really needs to insist that the authorities in those member states reject impunity and relentlessly pursue those responsible for the killing and attack of journalists. And then maybe controversially, because we've heard a lot on that from Martin and to a certain extent from Sonny, I would suggest just I know it will be controversial, but I would say in plain and simple terms, governments must get out of media. I've said that for a long time. They don't really belong there. But most people will argue the case and say, well, if we want to have free, independent and pluralistic environments, why can't the government also own media? But again, and Martin's sort of sketched the scenario in South Africa, these situations where governments are controlling the media are unlikely ever to improve the flow of information in cases where they dominate the media environment. And in too many of the African countries, governments continue to control state broadcasters, and they've resisted calls from civil society, media organizations to transform them into public broadcasters where they could mean more for the people. And I think it needs to be said here that a lot of assistance, a lot of help, a lot of funding comes from a lot of Commonwealth countries to governments in order to reinforce their strength in state-owned media. So I think that is something that really needs to be looked at as well. In Namibia, for example, again, one of the most free countries, government owns print media, the official news agency is owned by government, and so is the state broadcaster. So there can't be a level playing field for independent and free media to exist and flourish where government tend to dominate that environment. Also, as I say, in Namibia, which is regarded as one of the most free, our cabinet recently put out a directive instructing that state media should receive the lion's share of both advertising and information. And there again, in this era, as everybody knows here, where traditional media is facing many, many challenges, not least of all from the internet, also sometimes from its own inefficiencies, but largely speaking, where government are dominating the landscape, it's impossible to get enough bite of the cake for that free and independent media to survive. So we are very strongly at home through the Namibia Media Trust and a civil society organisation, Action Namibia, trying to get government to shift this off the agenda because we believe it's very dangerous. So this is an era when traditional media, I think generally speaking, in the Commonwealth are very, very at risk economically. We all know that print media is really suffering incredible setbacks in Europe and the America. And on our continent, I always fight for it as a very, very important thing indeed, because it's so key to media literacy. And to keep newspapers alive is very, very important. But as I say, if government continue to take from that cake and give to the state-owned media, I think that will endanger the sustainability of independent media more and more. Also, and it was mentioned in an earlier panel today, the plethora of internet shutdowns in Africa. That's something really that, has to be tackled at some point. It's a very worrying sign on the continent that as soon as there's any situation, and it can be for a very spurious reason, often for reasons of security, is the one that's given by governments, where they shut off the internet and silence a broad spectrum of society. In Cameroon, for example, we heard earlier, there's been a persistent and ongoing denial of access to approximately 20% of the population. In Uganda and other countries, governments have claimed the shutdowns have been motivated by security, but most of civil society understood that these were very spurious reasons to shut it down. And then added to this, and this has also been mentioned here by Sonny as well, while there seem to be very legitimate concerns about the issue of cybersecurity, this often provides the excuse for governments to threaten the online rights of both citizens and media, to use those cybersecurity laws to infringe on rights to free expression. In our part of the world, they're the so-called model laws on cybersecurity developed by governments through regional economic blocs, but these fail to consider the human rights perspective of internet governance, and in this way, issues such as online free speech are increasingly at risk. So overall, I think the adverse and deteriorating environment for media freedom in general across the Commonwealth has restricted rather than enhanced information flows of late, and has strengthened the voices of government rather than those of the people. I think it's imperative that increased pressure be applied to the Commonwealth to take a strong stance on media freedom and journalist safety before all confidence is lost. And lastly, may I say that perhaps we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We mentioned earlier the issue of the Windhoek Declaration, where journalists from across the African continent came together in 91 and really turned back the tide of government domination and led the way for recognition, or acceptance at least, of free, independent and pluralistic press. And that was followed in various other parts of the world by similar declarations. And so, as I say, the Commonwealth doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of work that has been done on media, broadcasting and internet rights and freedoms, which they could incorporate to give more strength to the Commonwealth stance and be more helpful to situations like Botswana and South Africa, among others. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed.